Well, good evening and welcome to our Deuteronomy study. We're doing this on Wednesday nights if you're just joining us, and if you want to go back and review, you can do that on our website and see some of the previous messages as well. But we are in the Ten Commandments right now, the 5th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy. We're going through what's called the Decalogue. Now, just like the name Deuteronomy, which means second law, is a Greek name, the word Decalogue is a Greek word as well, meaning 10 words. Deca, 10, logos, log, is 10 words. And so we get the name of Deuteronomy from the Greek Septuagint, which was a copy of the Old Testament scriptures that the Hebrews had, but the name of the book comes from the first words. These are the words. And so that's actually the Hebrew name for the book. But we're in Deuteronomy, and we're going through the Ten Commandments right now. We are on commandment number 5. This is the second part. Last week we looked at kind of the first part of this verse. There's a lot here in this command, it being one of those bridge commands between the commandments about God and the commandments about people. And so it's a very natural command to have right there beginning that series of admonitions the Lord gives to humanity about dealing with each other. And the first people we encounter, well, it's our parents. And so we learn from them, and we're to learn to honor and respect them and to obey them. And by doing so, we can also honor other people and obey the other commands that come afterwards. So how do we keep this command? Now, let me just kind of read this command again. I know we read it last week, but verse 16, chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And so he ties both life and the promise of land and prosperity in the land to this commandment, that the quality of your living is going to depend upon how you fulfill this. And so how do we do this? How do we keep this commandment? What is our part in this commandment? And we'll talk about God's part in just a little bit, because he talks about his part there at the end, but our part. First of all, I want to give you just a few principles here about how we keep this commandment. Number one, we need to have an understanding of the word honor. It's the first word in that verse, honor your father and your mother. Well, what does that mean, to honor them? You know, if you go to a ceremony in honor of someone, they may be talking about this person and listing all their accolades and all the accomplishments and things they've done, and we're here to honor this person tonight. Well, this word for the Hebrews was different than that and goes much, much deeper, because the word here actually means heavy, or to be laden down. In other words, this is important, that you should view these people as important in your life and people that are worthy of respect, that this issue of your parents is one of great importance, and it's not something to be taken lightheartedly. Parents are not people that we can just kind of shove out of the way once we kind of get away from them and forget about them, that we don't have to obey them and listen to them, and then when we become adults, we don't have to continue to still honor them, that there's a principle here of honoring your parents that has tentacles. And it goes to many other aspects of our life. And how we fulfill this will also determine how other people treat us in many respects. I mentioned last week that if we find ourselves talking about other authority figures in our life to our children, and we're not lifting them up or we're not honoring them in the eyes of our children, you know, kids are pretty smart. And after a while, they're going to say, you know, Dad doesn't honor his boss or the governor or whoever is an authority in his life. I don't really need to honor him. And so we can pass on a generational curse by demonstrating a lack of honor toward those who are in authority in our life to our children, and they in turn can do the same to us. And so we've got to be very careful. Brian Edwards, and I've mentioned his book on the Ten Commandments, and if you've not gotten it, it's a great book. If you want to study the Ten Commandments in depth, get Brian Edwards' book on the Ten Commandments. He writes in his book, long before a child thinks about murder, contemplates the passing pleasure of adultery, understands the apparent advantage of stealing, learns to lie, or yearns for the possessions of others, the child struggles to break free of parental discipline. I think that's true of every child. That's part of growing up. And even as children, we've got to put aside our natural inclinations and follow what the Lord would have us to do. That is always the first relationship to be trampled upon, and therefore the first one the child must learn to value. Those are very important words that Brian Edwards says there. This is always the first relationship to be trampled upon, and therefore the first one that the child must learn to value. And that's what this command is about, learning to value this relationship between parent and child. And so if we're going to keep this commandment, we've got to have an understanding of what does it mean to honor someone. And of course, honor comes from a love relationship. Parents loving a child and a child loving the parents. And honor also comes from living an honorable life. There's a great psalm in the book of Psalm, or the books of Psalm. There are 5 books in the book of Psalms in our Bible. And it's Psalm number 15. And it's really a good one to memorize. And I have memorized it, but just in case I forget a word or two, I'm going to read it. But it's a great psalm because it's about honor. And if you've ever been around honorable men or honorable women, you just know it. You just like these people. But you know, if you've ever been around a dishonorable person, you don't want to be around that person long. You're skeptical of them. You're not trusting of them. You just know this is a backstabber. This is someone you wouldn't want to be in a foxhole with in a war, because they might either shoot you or they're going to leave you and take off the other direction. You can't take what they say as being truthful. That they're just a dishonorable person. Listen to what is written by David in Psalm number 15 about honorable people. And he understood this because he had to have people around him who had to be honorable. And at one time in his life, he was not an honorable man. That whole Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite episode. But listen to what David writes. Lord, who may abide in your tabernacle? And who may dwell in your holy hill? And here's the answer. It's a rhetorical question, verse 1. He who walks uprightly and works righteousness, speaks the truth in his heart, does not backbite with his tongue, nor does evil to his neighbor, nor does he take up a reproach against his friend. You ever had someone like that? Just a coward? You think they're your friend, and all of a sudden you find out that, man, they wouldn't defend you because it's inconvenient or it may cost them something? That's what he's talking about there. It's someone who doesn't. They won't take up a reproach. They won't listen to it. Someone comes to them and says, let me tell you about your friend. They won't tolerate that. They won't take up a reproach against their friend. Verse 4, in whose eyes a vile person is despised. They don't want to be around vile people, dishonorable, disrespectful people. But he honors those who fear the Lord. He swears to his own hurt and does not change. No matter what it costs him, he's going to maintain his principles. He does not put out his money at usury, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. He who does these things shall never be moved. That's a person of honor right there. And so if we want to have honor from our children, we ought to emulate a life of honor. And you know, kids at some point in their life, they begin to figure out either mom or dad, they're not that honorable of a person. I'm not saying figuring out we've all got faults and flaws. That's going to happen. But and not discovering that the parents weren't perfect, because that happens too. Kids realize, mom and dad weren't perfect, but they realize they're honorable people because they see how they treat others. They see how they act in their life. There's an atmosphere of honor about them. There's this quality that is respectable about them. And so we get honor as we're an honorable person. So we need to have an understanding of honor. Number two is have an understanding of obedience. Now, this is that word that, man, nobody likes this word, obey. We don't want to obey somebody. They've taken these out of marriage vows, and they don't teach this word in school anymore. And child psychologists would say, "Ooh, that's too much to lay on a child to tell them to obey parents, because parents shouldn't have that kind of authority over their children." And well, obedience is very important. Colossians 3:20 says, "Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord." Now, when Paul writes these words, he's not writing to some 50-year-old man whose 80-year-old father is trying to tell him how to live his life. That's not what's going on here. He's talking to children. He uses the word children as if a juvenile, someone who is underage. There's another word for young people. In fact, I was studying this word yesterday. The word young man. There is another word for young woman. There's a word for young man that is specific to the Greek language. In fact, we see it in the book of Acts, and I'm running a rabbit here, and that's okay, because this is really interesting, where Paul's nephew finds out about a plot against him. Paul went to Jerusalem after many years, and he's there in the temple, and he gets assaulted by these Jews who hate him, and then this Roman soldier with this leader comes in with soldiers, and they get Paul. They rescue him. His name is Claudius Lysias, and he brings him into the forces of Antonio there, and they're protecting Paul, and the Jews send a kind of a message to Claudius Lysias saying, "Hey, we want to talk to this guy Paul again. Bring him out to us." Well, what happened was there was this plot against him, and Paul's nephew, Paul's sister's son, found out about this. And 3 times in that passage in Acts, and I'm not sure what chapter it's probably like 22 or something like that, it talks about young man. And the young man, and Claudius, brought the young man in. Well, here's the thing. When we say that in the South, young man, well, we're talking about some kid who's usually acting up. And we call a boy a young man. Well, that's a very specific Greek term, which means someone between the age of 25 and 40. This was a man, but he was a young man. And so he was probably he was probably part of the Pharisee sect, because Paul was, and no doubt Paul's father was. This was something that was, generational. Families, passed this on from one generation to the next. More than likely, Paul's sister had married a Pharisee, so they were interconnected in all this. And so this young man was there kind of interceding on Paul's behalf and talking about this plot with the Romans. If Paul was talking to adult children here, he would have used a different Greek term, but he's using a term here about a child. And so this is a word that he's giving to those who can understand. Children that have comprehension of this command, which, if you're 5 years old, this is understandable. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to the Lord. It makes the Lord joyful when you do this. That word there in the Greek, when Paul writes this about obey, is a 2-part Greek word. There's 2 words put together here. Hypa, H-Y-P-A, and kua, hypakua. Hypa means under, and kua means to listen. It means to sit under someone's teaching and to listen to them, is what it means. You're sitting at their feet and you're hearing what they're saying and you're listening to this. You're not just kind of, nodding off and zoning out and writing notes. You're saying, this is important. This person's giving me some really good information. And so he's saying, hey, you need to sit at your parents' feet and you need to listen to what they're saying to you. Again, this is not adult children he's talking about. And that does bring up a question of what about adult children? So you've got, some 28-year-old young man or young woman, and their parents still think that they ought to be bossing them around. Well, that is not God's design, because when a child becomes an adult, we're to let them go, and we're to let them be in the hands of the Lord. And because of the priesthood of the believer, this is someone who is making decisions, the Lord is leading them. They're no longer under our tutelage, and we need to help them to come to a place to where they feel released. They don't feel like they're always under the shadow of mom and dad. And, here I am, a 35-year-old man living in mom and dad's basement. I've always got to ask permission, and, what do I do about this? And I can't live my life, and I can't do anything because I've got to always get the approval of my parents. That is not healthy. It's not what is going on here. And so at some point in a Christian's life, as they become an adult, they begin to relate to the Lord as an adult. And this is the priesthood of the believer, that every one of us relates to God, and He speaks to us, and we're accountable to Him. And so as Christian parents, we want to get our children to the point to where we turn them loose. When our daughter, I've mentioned whenever she was sick in the hospital, she was 18, she was an adult. And the doctors would walk in and they would say, well, now, Britton, she's got this. And I said, what do you guys think about if we do this procedure? And she's sitting there, and I'm like, well, ask her. She's an adult. And so we wanted her to begin to make adult decisions. And so that's part of turning loose of a child and letting them grow up. And, I can still make suggestions to my children, and I can still encourage them to do some things. And hopefully they see me as being a wise person who I've had some experience in life, and I can give them some insight. But I don't think it's my place now to tell my adult children how to live their lives and what to do. And I don't think they've got to come get permission from me to do things. And I think that's a biblical, that's has a good biblical foundation to it. So, Paul reminds us about this command that we're to obey, as children we're to obey our parents. That's part of honoring our parents. Interestingly enough, failure to obey our parents is a sign of our sinful nature, a sign of rebellion. Romans 1:28. Romans, not 28. There's no Romans 28. There's 16, but there's no 28. Romans 1:28 through 32 says this, and even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, to be filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things. Right in the middle of all of this terrible carnage of sinfulness, disobedient to parents. Yeah, that's right next to inventors of evil things. Undiscerning, unworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do death, disobedient to parents are worthy of death. That's what Paul's saying here. Rebellion is about, brings eternal death. Not only do the same, but they approve of those who practice them. And so we see rebellion against parents is just part of human nature, fallen human nature. And if we continue down that road and we rebel against our parents and we don't want to listen to them, we hate them, we don't honor them, it's a great indication that we've never become a follower of Christ. Also, when we see an epidemic of childhood disobedience to parents, that's a great indicator that the end of the world is near. Listen to what Paul writes in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1. But know this, in the last days, perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, heady, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power. From such people turn away. In the last days, perilous times will come. And one of the indicators of perilous times is, well, disobedience to parents. And so we need to have an understanding of what it means to be obedient and to obey our parents. Moving on to number 3, we need to have an understanding of the concept of authority. And home is the place where children begin to understand authority, because we run into authority all throughout our lives. Even the most self-made person out there still runs into authority. I mean, even the President of the United States, he runs into authority because we have checks and balances. There's a Congress and there's the Supreme Court, and and there's still rules that he has to go by and things like that. And so where we first encounter the concept of authority is in the home. And we need to embrace that and understand it. Because whenever we don't want the authority that is in the home, we are rejecting God's delegated authority. We are saying, I don't need what God has put in my life. I can do without that. I can be the one in charge here. And this is just rank rebellion is what this is. And God's judgment has come the swiftest. We've seen it in Scripture over and over again. His judgment comes the swiftest on people, and in the harshest, I might add, on those who are rebellious against authority. Just give you a couple of examples here. There's a guy by the name of Korah. Korah was a leader in Israel during the Exodus. And if you read in the book of Jude, it talks about 3 people that are mentioned as terrible people. One of those talks about the rebellion of Korah. Well, in Numbers 16, we see this, where this guy Korah leads a rebellion against Moses, against the authority that is in his life, the delegated authority that God had put Moses in charge. Well, Korah didn't like that, and he was like, I don't understand why this guy Moses gets to make all these decisions. There's a lot of smart people out there. I'm a smart guy. A lot of us are smart people. We ought to be able to make decisions too, not just this one guy. And so we see this guy, Korah. And verse 2 of chapter 16 of Numbers, and they rose up before Moses, some of the children of Israel, 250 leaders of the congregation, representatives of the congregation, men of renown. Now, this wasn't the rabble. This wasn't a bunch of malcontents sitting around just complaining. These were people that were respected. And I mean, they were loved by the families, and they were people that folks came to for advice and counsel, and they were the influencers, so to speak. This would be the bunch that John Maxwell would want to gather together, the influencers. He says, that's what he says when you get to a church, you ought to gather up all the influencers, I don't want to go into all that, but I don't agree with Mr. Maxwell on his philosophy of leadership. They gathered together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, you take too much upon yourselves, for all the congregation is holy. He's like, hey, we're all good people here. Every one of them. And the Lord is among them. I mean, he's making a valid point that these are God's people. We're all God's people. You're not the only holy person here. You're not the only person that God can speak to. Why do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord? Now, this grieved Moses, fell on his face. I mean, he's just, he's constantly, having to deal with things like this. Bottom line is, God, says, all right, we'll solve this. Says, you let those people come before me, and I'll show who I pick. Of course, he picks Moses and Aaron. And as a result, God destroys these people. In verse 33, so they all of those went down alive into the pit. It says the earth opened up in verse 32 and swallowed up all the men with Korah and their goods, their households. And they all perished from among the assembly. And, it was a horrible thing, all because of rebellion. There's a second person I want to mention who was the son of a king. And it's David's son, Absalom. And Absalom is a spoiled, rich brat. And he just is at odds. He gets his feelings hurt all the time. And somehow he kind of gets out of sort with his father. And in 2 Samuel chapter 15, we see Absalom make a play for the throne. He's not willing to wait for his father to die and him to become the king. He wants to be the king now. And here's how he does it. Verse 1, chapter 15, 2 Samuel. After this had happened, Absalom provided himself with chariots and horses and 50 men to run beside him. He's an egomaniac, is what he is. And Absalom would rise early and stand beside the way of the gate. So he'd sit outside the city, the gate, where they'd open the gates up. People are waiting to come in the city because they want to go see the king. They want to go, they've got a problem. They want, some government official to help them. So it was that whenever anyone who had a lawsuit came to the king for a decision, that Absalom would call to him and say, "Hey, what city are you from?" And he would say, "Your servant is from such and such a tribe of Israel." And Absalom would say to him, "Look, you got a good case. And it's right. But there's no deputy of the king to hear you. Nobody's going to listen to you." I mean, and then he would say in verse 4, it says, "And moreover, Absalom would say, 'Oh, that I were made judge in the land. And everyone who has a suit or a cause would come to me, and I would give them justice.'" You ever heard somebody say something like this? "Well, if I were the boss, I wouldn't put up with this kind of stuff. I tell you what, if I were the pastor, we wouldn't have all this stuff going on." That's the spirit of Absalom. It's a spirit of rebellion. It's a manipulative ploy. I've seen people do this. Just, they like to listen to people's complaints. And people will come to them because they'll listen to them, and then it's like, "Man, I'm sorry. It's terrible what you're going through," and the boss or the pastor or whoever that, "I hate they're not going to help you out here." I mean, if it were me, I'd help you out, because you make a good point here about what's going on. And if I had that job, I'd take care of this stuff. And it was that whenever anyone came near to bow down to him, that he would put out his hand to take him and kiss him. I mean, this guy is a sleazy politician. And he's stabbing his father in the back. And verse 6 says this, "In this manner, Absalom acted toward all of Israel who came to him, to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel." And of course, we know what happened to Absalom. He gets killed. He foments this rebellion. David has to flee with all of his household. It's a horrible humiliation for David. And in the end, Absalom dies like a dog. I mean, it's horrible what happened to this guy, but it's all because God does not tolerate rebellion, and we need to understand that. David learned this lesson. I don't know if he ever tried to pass it on to Absalom. He learned this lesson. And whenever he was being pursued by Saul, he wouldn't touch Saul. He could have killed him on a number of occasions, and he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't let his men do this. I mean, Saul's in a cave sleeping, and David sneaks in there and could have cut his throat and ended all of this. I mean, David was on the run for 7 years, maybe longer. And he could have ended all this misery that he and his men are going through, this exile, but he wouldn't. And the reason why was because he knew that Saul, as horrible as he was God's delegated authority. And he had no right to touch Saul. None. If Saul was going to die, that was God's business, not David's. And this is a very important point that we all need to learn, that we don't have the right to just cut somebody's throat, so to speak, who's in authority over us because we don't like them, or they don't share our opinion, or we think we can find somebody else. If God put that person there, that's very important. And you need to make sure that you just don't foment some rebellion to get rid of them because of whatever reasons. That's God's business. Now, He may use people to come along and help someone to exit who needs to because of whatever, but it's not something that we should ever take lightly. And we need to understand that God takes this deadly serious. He really, really does. There's a guy by the name of J.C. Massey. He writes these words: "There can be no moral authority in the universe without proper recognition of authority on the part of those who are subject to authority." Let me read that again. There can be no moral order in the universe without proper recognition of authority on the part of those who are subject to authority. The most necessary and wholesome lesson, therefore, for children born into the world is that he shall learn obedience to a properly constituted authority. And you know what? We don't like that, do we? Our flesh hates that. It does. We don't want to listen to a properly constituted authority. We don't want to obey these people. We want to talk about them, hate them, laugh at them, mock them, make memes about them on social media, stuff like that. But, learn obedience to a properly constituted authority? Come on. That's silly. Not to God. And so parents are God's delegated authority on earth, and they should be respected by their children. They should be. So moving on to number 4, and let me just change something here. We need to have an understanding of discipline. Discipline. Because that's part of the process of growing up, and part of what a parent is called to do is to discipline a child. And through discipline, help them to learn self-discipline. You can't ever have self-discipline if you've never been disciplined. We've got to learn it from the outside before we can ever have it on the inside. And there are many people in this world who have no self-discipline because they never received the proper discipline from parents. And so this is very, very important. I want to go to Hebrews. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. Listen to what Paul, or whoever it was who wrote Hebrews, writes. If you endure chastening, he's talking about, discipline. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? Well, there are many to answer that question, and they end up usually being terrible people. For if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. And what he's saying is, if God doesn't chasten you and doesn't discipline you, you're not one of His children. I don't discipline other people's kids. It's not my place. And God's saying, well, you're not my sons. I'm not going to discipline you. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. There's a greater reason for chastening. It's not just to punish people, not just to bend you to someone's will. For God, it's that we can have a relationship with Him. Now, no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but is painful. Nevertheless, afterwards it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. So, the discipline that children receive should be redemptive. There should be, it's not just about because I'm angry and my kids are acting crazy and I'm just going to make them pay. No. Discipline should always be redemptive. It should always have a goal of making this person a better person. And in God's case, it's about growing us in holiness. and for us to have a deeper relationship with Him. And so again, discipline must always emanate from love, not from anger, not out of retribution. Godly discipline has always been designed to grow us and at times to bring us back to Him. And parental discipline is the same. It shouldn't cause us to hate or resent our parents. If that's the kind of discipline, that may not be godly discipline. It may just be just retribution and just, horrible punitive actions that, are abusive. So we need to understand discipline. I'm going to move a little bit quicker here because now we're moving into God's part. And so God's part, back over in Deuteronomy 5:16, is this part where it says that the Lord commanded you that your days may be long and that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. And so there's some general principles here, okay? When we read principles like this, we don't need to take them as this is ironclad and always is going to result the way we think it's going to result. For example, it talks about your days would be long. That's a general principle. Not everybody in Israel, who obeyed their parents and honored their parents, lived what we would call long lives. However, they lived good lives. I've known many people, I've done many funerals for younger people who were great, wonderful Christians and honored the Lord. Who are we to say what a long life is? Now, we want to define it as, 80, 90 years old, we're sitting around, one day, and all of our grandchildren and great children are around us, and they're listening to us, and then we're gone. That's a long life. Well, that's one definition, but God's got His own definition of what a long life is. And so these are general principles. Israel would prosper as a people if this command was obeyed. So generational rebellion, when rebellion would enter into the DNA of Israel and it would kind of spread throughout the people, would bring destruction. The Israelites themselves would live long and prosper, but there's always what we would call exceptions, that someone would die as a young person. A young father would be killed in an accident or something like that. So did God lie here? No, He didn't lie. We understand that this is by and large a general principle that God is giving to Israel. And most of the time it applies to most people, but there's always going to be those exceptions where God allows something to happen. And so not all followers of Yahweh lived, as I mentioned, what we would define as a long life, but it's what God defines as a long life. And not all of them would be prosperous as what we would define prosperity as being. But in His minds, they were prosperous. They may have been very content and peaceful with what they had, what small things they had, because God took care of them, and they did prosper. You see, just like we want to define what sin is for ourselves and for other people, and we want to define what success is, we also want to define what long life is and what prosperity in the land is. And that's just not the case. God is the one who gives the definition. In terms of a long life, 33 years is not a long time, is it? I'm 55, and I feel great. I'm very happy being 55. I wouldn't want to go back really to any age. I'm happy right here where I am. But 33 is that seems like the prime of life. And if someone were to die at 33, that would be it would seem like they didn't live a very long life. Oh yeah, that's right. Jesus died at 33. So, but His life was long. It was long enough. It's the exact time the Lord wanted Him to live. And here, I'm going to give you something right here. At Jesus' death, on the cross, He kept this command. Listen to, even in His horrific suffering, He's thinking about other people, and one of those is His mother. But not just His mother, He's honoring her. He's keeping the law. I'm going to read something to you I wrote yesterday. I'm writing my second book on apologetics, almost done with it. I'm looking forward to getting it published, by the summer. So John 19:25-27. Now there stood by the cross the cross of Jesus, his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus therefore saw his mother, the disciple whom he loved, standing by, and that's always John's way of referring to himself, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her took her to his own home. Here Jesus is keeping this commandment. So I'm gonna read what I wrote yesterday. This is one of the entries in my second book, talking about apologetics from the cross. Jesus makes 7 statements on the cross, and this is the third statement that I deal with. This is what he just said about John and his mother. So bear with me as I read. This has not been edited, so there may be a little bit of stuff I've got to kind of smooth over here. Family is often in the thoughts of dying people. Even hardened men who lay dying from combat will cry out for their mothers. This interaction that Jesus has with Mary and John is not mere sentimentality. Jesus fulfills the law and keeps the 5th of the 10 commandments by honoring his mother. In just a few moments, the old covenant will be fulfilled, and the new covenant will begin as he breathes his last breath. But even so, Jesus, in keeping the law and pointing to the new covenant with this proclamation he's keeping the law and pointing to the new covenant with this proclamation from the cross. Galatians 4:4. You probably heard me quote this before. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. Jesus was born of Mary at the exact proper time, and likewise, in the proper fulfillment of time, she would witness his death. He was also born under the law, which he had given to Israel on Mount Sinai, and was about to bring the law to a completion on Mount Calvary. Jesus keeps the law even in its last waning moments of being in effect. With the fulfillment of the Old Covenant, the New Covenant would be sealed with our Lord's blood and thus allow for the adoption of those who had no claim to God's family. What better picture of adoption into the family of Jesus could there be than John being adopted by Mary's son, being adopted as Mary's son? Jesus is not only thinking about how he could provide for his mother once he was gone, but he is also doing a greater act by showing that adoption into his eternal family can only come by the acclamation of God himself. Jesus performs an adoption ceremony on the cross that simultaneously fulfills his obligation as a son, provides for his mother in her remaining earthly years, and starts his work as the greatest agent of adoption that the world has ever seen. And so, when our Lord gave this command on Mount Sinai, he knew that he would have to fulfill this command at the end of this covenant on the cross as he lay dying. He would have to honor his mother in that moment. But also, by doing so, would point to the fact that his death would bring about the adoption of many people into his family. So, going back, if you want to know more, read the book when it comes out. So he talks about also about prospering in the land, that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. This is to have God's favor, that God is with you, that he's not opposed to you, that he's not, just abandoned you to your own devices. He's with you and he's protecting you. But nothing removes his hand of protection faster than rebellion to authority. Nothing does. If you want to be outside of God's favor, just rebel against those people that are in authority over you, and you'll be outside of his favor. He won't honor you, and he won't protect you. Honoring one's parents means honoring one's Creator by extension. And if you honor your Creator, he's going to honor and bless you. And so the Lord, His part is that, yes, He gives us life and He protects our lives. And He's with us for the length of our life. And I'm sure whenever we get to heaven, if we were 14 whenever we died, or if we were 98 when we died, we're going to say that was a long and prosperous life, because the Lord was with us in those moments and He blessed us. And so as we obey this command, we see God's part being to give us a great quality of life, a long life in His eyes, and also prosperity by His definition of what prosperity is. And we should be content with what the Lord gives us. This is a great command. It really is. It's one of those commands that's just, it's just so packed full of great theology that we need to understand and know about and study. And there's a lot to this. And I hope that as you're studying the Ten Commandments, that you will really kind of camp out on this one. I hope you've enjoyed studying this fifth commandment. Look forward to seeing you on the Lord's Day coming up. And may God bless you, and may He give you His grace and mercy this week. Good night.